Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short, and of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on the Bear Market Brief.
So about that meeting in the Oval Office, you know the one. What on earth happened? I'm Aaron Schwartzbaum. This is the Bear Market Brief, and a caveat to kick things off this time around. We're a little delayed here. It's my fault. It's not FPRI's. The narrative has progressed since this meeting. There have been further rounds of negotiations, a potential ceasefire on the table. We'll see. So I would think about what I discussed with our guest this episode in the context of Trump's strategic interests and aims versus an up-to-date picture of exactly what's going on. My guest in this endeavor to understand what happened is Maximilian Hess, the founder of and Medina Advisory, a London-based political risk consultancy specializing in the intersection of politics and credit markets. He's also a fellow here at FPRI and an associate fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. A new edition of his book, Economic War, Ukraine and the Global Conflicts Between Russia and the West, will be published in April 2025. The first edition was great. Highly recommend you read it, by the way. So, let's jump in. Max, welcome back to the Bear Market Brief.
Aaron, thank you so much for having me. It's good to join you as always, if a little head spinning in these times.
Yes, a little head spinning, and I think we're going to jump straight in on that note. I think the question, which comes directly from our episode title today, what just went down in the Oval Office? What even happened?
So, I'll say firstly what I think, some of the coverage has been like, and then give my view. This has gone down in Europe in particular like a bag of cold sick. A lot of European leaders, including perhaps most notably the likely next German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, said that this is a historic moment for Europe, one that marks a turning point in which they can essentially no longer see the U.S. as the core security ally. And in some ways that it may even risk becoming not quite an adversary, but certainly not a partner even. Not all European leaders necessarily have gone quite that far. This does have a little bit of political alignment, perhaps more supportive comments, certainly from Hungary's Viktor Orban, somewhere near a middle ground from Giorgia Meloni in Italy, and Emmanuel Macron also somewhere near there, and then Keir Starmer in the UK in particular saying, well, we still need the US to be part of any final security project. Now, a lot of the coverage that I read essentially is a debate over whether this was an intentional ambush by the Trump administration of Zelensky, or at least certain individuals within the Trump administration or around it. It is, a big tent in its own way, but it is not a cohesive one, including on foreign policy matters, although certainly the Ukrainian critical Russian revisionist division of that administration certainly seems to be very much at the forefront and likely to continue to be for the foreseeable future. Or whether, this was Zelensky and the Ukrainians trying to make clear that they wouldn't be drawn into a ceasefire that was so disadvantageous to Ukraine and situation that essentially laid the blame on Kiev for a war that Russia indisputably started in 2014 and then escalated into this global crisis, not only for European security, but for much of the international economy that has been the focus of my research in 2022. Now, how I sort of see this is in line with one colleague of ours, Nick Gostev, who wrote about this. I do think in some ways, there is a method to the madness of the Trump administration's approach and is trying to set the parameters for negotiations that did not exist prior to even necessarily this failed summit, despite the launch of at least bilateral Russia-U.S.
What Nick Gvozdev had said, just for listeners, was that this chapter, the end of military aid, is just announced. This was chapter 1 in negotiations. This wasn't the end of negotiations to start. Now we know the Russian position, we know the U.S. position and Ukrainian position, and there will be more rounds. Whether or not you, listener, agree, that was the arguments made. Back to you, Max.
Yes. And, I think if you are critical, in particular, of what has just happened, it still behooves one to try to see if there is a method to the madness, or if this is just a complete reversal and hard drive to U.S. Isolationism and an attempt to be hegemonic while at the same time retreating from traditional U.S. positions. And how I see this is, I'm not sure there's a method to the madness yet, but as I said, I believe it's important to try to understand that and see what's going on. And that argument, I think, that Nick advanced about this being sort of step one and getting some room for those talks in the first place, it has to be seriously considered at the very least. And in some ways, I take a view from that the Trump administration, in particular Donald Trump himself, their interest is clear, as Donald Trump has insisted on finding a way to end at least the active fighting without necessarily caring about the ramifications that the terms of that end of fighting have for European security, the international political economy, and at least the traditional view of U.S. security. Now, that leads me to believe, however, that Trump is still who Trump is, and there are certain things I think he will be unwilling to countenance, like while we've seen this aid freeze now, saying it is part of the negotiations with Zelensky on this so-called critical minerals deal and finding ways to continue to support, it also is essentially an attempt to show that he is willing to potentially even abandon Ukraine to try to escalate that. Now, I'm not sure that I take that credibly, because I don't think Trump, being who he is, would want to have in his legacy Russian tanks rolling into Kiev, Kharkiv, further Russian aggression into major Ukrainian cities, because he knows that will forever be a blot on his legacy, even if he doesn't care about the international security aspects. But I think Trump wants to make sure that threat is at least credible to force the Ukrainians into what I think is a weak negotiating position. And so he's willing to take high-risk steps with the U.S.'s at least heretofore allies and partners in search of a headline, perhaps even short-term gain, but with long-term pain, so long as it makes him look like he's delivering on his stated agenda. And as I think I've implied, even if there is this method to the madness that I've sort of tried to sketch out here, I'm not sure that, even leaving aside questions of relative competency in negotiating all these things, that the actual desired end outcomes are in the national security interests of the United States and the interests of the Euro-Atlantic order, both on a security basis and on a basis of international political economy. And that's where I perhaps see some sunlight in all of this, which is that Donald Trump is very much aligned to Vladimir Putin on a personality basis. I think he in some ways sees them as kindred spirits. And certainly, we can point to his comments about Zelensky being a dictator, in my opinion, are complete nonsense, because not only is Zelensky democratically elected, he was democratically elected in an election in which he was seen as more willing to hold talks with Russia, and did indeed at least attempt to do so in 2019. And Trump, of course, has good bonhomie with many genuine dictators, such as Kim Jong-un of North Korea, who he happily went and feted at a summit in Singapore in his first administration. So, all that being said, we stand here on the precipice of a potential major turning point in not only Ukraine's history, but in the history of Europe, the United States, and Vladimir Putin's Russia. The stakes could not possibly be higher. I'm not sure that I like the odds that the gamblers at the table have.
Yeah, to say the very least. Now, I guess there's two strings I want to pull here, and we are definitely a nuts and bolts podcast. I have to say, it's a little funny. A lot of the time talking about these issues, we have to do a lot of context explaining. And this time, I feel like many of our listeners, the general public, is actually aware of what's going on. So that's new. I guess one of the questions surrounded, the potential collapse of negotiations, this minerals deal. Can you talk a little bit about what the mineral deal is, what the alleged benefits of it are?
Okay, so the minerals deal, essentially, the roughest sketch I can give you is it's a memorandum of understanding, not a binding contract or not an international treaty, although it does call for Zelensky to submit it to the Ukrainian parliament, but ironically not Trump to submit it to the U.S. Senate, whose constitutionally defined role is to approve of treaties. So its status under international law, and full disclosure, I'm not an international lawyer, is also something that is relatively untested, were it be to be finalized. But also, as I said, it's a memorandum of understanding, not a sort of binding contract on any of these things. What it essentially is on paper is saying that the U.S. will help guide and potentially see some benefit directed towards it from future investments in not only Ukraine's rare earths, which is what Trump was talking about so often, but broader commodities development in the future in a post-war situation. Now, none of that is going to happen until not only there is a ceasefire, but a long-lasting ceasefire, and in many of these areas will be at or near the front lines, and then, of course, demining efforts take decades from smaller wars, and this has, of course, been the largest war on the European continent since the Second World War. So really, and then the one also point I'll make on that is somebody who deals a lot in the world of actual contracts of intergovernment negotiations. This is, as I said, not anywhere near the level of an actual contract or treaty. But what it is in the Trump administration's framing of it is that this is a way of saying that the U.S. will be permanently economically invested in Ukraine going forward. And so therefore, Kyiv should basically take that as a security guarantee rather than any actual hard binding security guarantee. It is certainly an example of transactionalism at its worst. It's too broadly worded now to say, one cannot go out and definitively say, as some of the critics have been, oh, this is the U.S. robbing Ukraine of $400 billion in future commodities revenues or something like that. But at the same time, Trump seems to think that that is what it should lead to. That is a very rapacious form of U.S. foreign policy that has existed before, particularly in the 19th century, but has not been used in that way in most of the U.S.'s post-Second World War history, where investments in foreign countries have been supported by U.S. government credit, by government-backed insurance programs, by loans that are repaid. Actual taking control of assets is something that did happen in the U.S.'s Latin America policy, as I said, in the 19th century. But it's also exactly what the Trump administration accused China of doing with the Belt and Road repeatedly, and people in the non-Trump administration in a far more naked and callous manner. Now, as I said, that's not guaranteed by the contract, but if Trump has made clear that's what he wants the contract or so-called minerals deal to eventually lead to.
Now, and I guess I'll just ask directly, is your Atlanticism dead?
It is on life support. It may very well soon expire. That doesn't mean it will be insurrectable in the future. But like Frankenstein, it will come back in potentially a more grotesque form or in a form that is conversely far more shattered, and that would probably only be after this administration, even if there is some kind of return to a more normal Trump administration position vis-a-vis Russia.
So I guess the follow-up question there, that in mind, what are Europe's options here? Let's talk about how we find the continent, not to reference another podcast of mine, but
Sure. Europe only really has one option, which is to unite and understand that should it be operating from the basis that it is on its own, and prepare for that reality. Hope it doesn't come to pass. But in particular, this is something that Britain needs to realize as the U.S.'s foremost security ally, one that is technically also outside the core European alliance now of the European Union. It has real questions to face about how it addresses its position vis-a-vis those two strands and has an important bridging role to play. If it is whatever form of Euro-Atlanticism may survive or the like, will probably require Britain to be the one bridging the gap, just as when Euro-Atlanticism came under such threat in the early 2000s over George Bush's unilateral invasion of Iraq. Remember, at that time we had French President Chirac and the German Chancellor Schröder going to Moscow to meet with Vladimir Putin at the same time as Tony Blair and George Bush were planning that invasion of Iraq. So Britain will have a role to play there that's very important. For Europe, in the EU, it is really about unity on defense matters. We've seen key steps there with Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, calling for defense spending to essentially be taken out of the EU's budgetary rules. Coalition talks in Germany talking about radically changing Germany's defense spending posture. And that's something where perhaps we have reached a tipping point, even if we've heard it 1,000 times before, but Germany will be the key test for that. So, listeners to this podcast will probably be aware of Germany's reticence in general to borrow for expenditures. Its reticence to do so on a European level in particular, as we saw after the Eurozone financial crisis of the early 2010s and refusal to bail out Greece, or helps struggling smaller European economies at the time, like Portugal and Ireland. And essentially the narrative in Germany has been, well, we have to save billions and billions because one day a big crisis will come and we need to be able to do so. And nobody should kid themselves that crisis hasn't come now.
So let's talk about what two of the main protagonists, antagonists, depending on your politics in this story, actually want. So Trump likes deals. I think that's not a partisan comment. He will tell you himself. What does he want broadly? Help me understand his geopolitical vision here. I mean, there's ostensibly a much higher degree of China hawkishness in the administration. Broadly, what is he working towards?
I think that Trump wants to return to a world in which, again, is as I said earlier, even pre-1940s and pre-World War I U.S. foreign policy, although at the time it was primarily constrained to Latin America, which is to act in a hegemonic manner. And essentially, he's fine with allowing spheres of influence elsewhere in the world, so long as the U.S. is by far the largest. Now, this, of course, comes after years and years in which people like ourselves and think tanks have talked about the relative decline of U.S. hegemony. I've actually been somewhat more conservative on that, particularly because I look at things from an international economic manner and see that the U.S.'s role in global money and credit markets is as dominant as it has ever been, despite the BRICS challenges and despite, people occasionally talking about, U.S. dollar trade is at 60% from 70% and so on and so forth. I mean, that's still exponentially larger than any other. And so the risk, however, though, is that, of course, perhaps one of the phrases that defined that period was Teddy Roosevelt's, speak softly and carry a big stick. And we currently have an administration that wants to carry a big stick, even if it whacks it against allies, and does not speak softly, but may not realize that in some ways that stick is not as powerful as it once was.
Flip side here, ostensibly, Russia is signaling it wants negotiations. It's two questions. It's two questions for the price of one. What does Vladimir Putin want in approaching negotiations? I mean, I think we understand his war aims well, but we should name them. And then question two, what might motivate Vladimir Putin to even come to the negotiating table now? And there's some political theory. Nice as negotiations and peace are, war is bad. It's another nonpartisan statement we can make here on this podcast. But nobody negotiates for peace because peace is good. There are always material reasons. We can't fight. We can't achieve any more military aims. So there's a need to come to the table because that will yield better results than are otherwise capable. So to rehash, what does Putin want and what might he gain from negotiations?
So I'm going to say, obviously, Kremlinology has been a thing for a very long time. Media access in Russia, both from international journalists and local journalists, is more constrained than it has been at any point, probably since the Brezhnev era in 1970 Soviet Union. I'm not going to pretend that I have any better insight into what Putin secretly wants than anything else. I think we should just take him at his word, and that actually a lot of people trying to over-interpret Putin gets him wrong. And so I'll begin by saying that Vladimir Putin cares about two things. He cares about making Russia a true great power, and he cares about weakening the Euro-Atlantic alliance and hopefully destroying it. He talks about Russia's great power status very frequently. He takes specific actions aimed to try to drive Europe and the West apart. And I've argued before that I think that's a key reason why he launched the full-scale invasion exactly when he did. He thought it was an opportune moment to do so and perhaps miscalculated there. And what differs from China, in my view, is that China wants to replace the U.S. over the long term as the keynote around which the international order essentially orbits, and has a long-term strategy to do so. Vladimir Putin knows that Russia is not going to be in any position to do so, but can be a great power in a world in which everybody else is weaker. And for Russia to achieve that, it primarily has to do so by taking on the Euro-Atlantic order. Now, that being said, I don't think that NATO, for example, is the part of that Euro-Atlantic order that Vladimir Putin particularly cares about, right? So a lot of this narrative has been, Ukraine and Biden administration, too much flirting with NATO, and this made Putin attack is complete nonsense. Putin uses NATO as perhaps my favorite phrase from film studies, the MacGuffin. So the MacGuffin is the Golden Fleece in Jason and the Argonauts, or even the Ring in the Lord of the Rings. It is the plot narrative instrument used to keep the story going along, but which actually is immaterial to the true concerns and the motivations of the characters, right? I mean, Lord of the Rings is ultimately a story about friendship, not ultimately a story about hiking to the top of a mountain to throw a ring in some fire. Putin uses that to drive up his domestic narrative and try to get there in the West. But when Sweden and Finland joined NATO in the last 2 years, including right on Russia's border, we saw no reaction there whatsoever. He's far more motivated by his nationalist aims in Ukraine and desire to essentially, quite literally, expand Russia in the most classical sense, and that he wants to drive Europe and the U.S. further apart. And I think for a long time, his efforts were primarily on trying to get enough European allies to break away from the European security posture and alliance with the United States. We see that with his close alignment with Viktor Orban, financial support there, even discounted gas deliveries throughout the time. A number of other European governments, the far right in Austria, the Freedom Party, with whom he used to essentially plant spies throughout not only European corporations, but European intelligence services, or funding for right-wing or populist and also left-wing fringe parties across the EU, but now sees it as an opportunity to use the U.S. to drive that apart. So that's perhaps an inverse from where things have been before, but certainly Putin is happy to take that opportunity once it is given to him. And what he really cares about in that in particular, and this is where the U.S. should be primarily concerned, is he's far more motivated not by Europe's security weakness or relative actually caring who's in government in Paris or not, but he cares about the international economic order, and particularly that dollar-led system that exists, but that is a core part of the European-U.S. relationship, right? The euro is the most successful alternative currency project in the world since the end of Bretton Woods by a significant distance, but it traditionally acts in step with the U.S., including on foreign policy matters where we see disagreements. So perhaps the most notable example of that came from Trump's first administration, where there was the big divergence between the Europeans and the U.S. on the JCPOA, the Iran deal, and whether it should be withdrawn. Trump unilaterally did so, and although the Europeans made some noise and briefly talked about an effort to try to enable European trade with Iran in ways that evaded U.S. sanctions concerns, ultimately conceded that was impossible, and were happy to abandon the effort as part of keep maintaining good economic relations with the United States. And Putin talks about the dollar system. I track it, and almost twice as often as he talks about NATO. If you add in BRICS and his sort of challenger efforts, it's well over. It's nearly 3 times as often. And so that, however, is at the core, in my view, of the U.S.'s international strength, right? And a failure to realize how important the U.S.'s international position is to its domestic power is very important. And here I would just make one last comment on sort of the Trump dynamic as well, which is Dan Nexon and Alex Cooley published a very good book a few years ago that was the first to kind of lay out this argument. I've seen it made in a few other places more recently, which is that in some ways, Trump risks making some of Gorbachev's mistakes, which is that by attempting a reform of how the U.S. is administered domestically and over focusing on that and essentially neglecting the international partnerships that keep it going, just as Gorbachev did in the Soviet Union, and particularly between the Union republics, risks weakening the foundational basis of the state by over focusing in that way.
Yeah, some interesting arguments similarly that there's a lot of, and I think not unjustified commentary that Europe should play a leading role in its own security. I wouldn't say I disagree with that on an editorial note, but comments that there's going to be a lot of complaints once Europe starts doing that. But let's, as our fun special treat at the end here, really talk about some political economy, have some light at the end of the tunnel here, as always in the last couple of years. Pretty bleak episode, as it tends to be about much of everything we talk about here. But let's assume we've arrived at peace. Now, we've just heard that Trump has ordered OFAC, which is the Office of Foreign Asset Control at the Treasury. They not exclusively do sanctions, but they're the leading office in targeting who is sanctions, who isn't. Trump has ordered OFAC to come up with a sanctions relief package. What I want to understand is what sanctions they could relieve in the last couple minutes here, but also some of the implications for Russia's economy should sanctions be lifted. I wonder, would U.S. corporations be willing to invest in fixed assets in Russia again, like in the early 2000s? Can Russia afford the economic impact of the war ending? That is what it's keeping its economy afloat, overheated, but afloat. So what might that look like? What options do we have? A lot to talk about there. We'll kind of lob the ball into your side of the court and see what's most interesting to you.
Sure. So on OFAC in particular and its role in the main U.S. sanctions instrument, which is called specifically designated nationals, SDN designation, but also others that are core to Russia policy, such as the sectoral sanctions list that limit investment in oil and gas projects and loans, although those have largely been superseded by SDN designations of most of Russia's largest state corporations and many of its private corporations as well, or at least nominally private corporations since 2022. A lot of those key measures are actually protected by legislation passed in 2017 called CAATSA, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, that requires an affirmative vote in both houses of Congress for sanctions to be lifted. The Biden administration also put a lot of the designations that were imposed from 2022 to 2024 under executive orders, essentially relabeling them because executive orders are what give OFAC the legal authority to do that were specifically mentioned in CAATSA. The Trump administration may well try to find legal challenges to this, and it will in many ways also depend on how willing Congress is to act on it. Of course, nominally the Republicans have full control of both chambers. The sort of lifting of it also is normally something that you would look for a diplomatic-led process through the State Department. So it is a bit of while the administration side of it comes through OFAC, that may speak to issues within divisions in the Trump administration. Remember, Marco Rubio 2 months ago was very hawkish on Russia policy and sanctions, and also on NATO, and voted in favor of legislation passed last year requiring Congress and the Senate in particular to ensure that it could act to prevent any unilateral withdrawal from NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, this is where I continue to sort of remain skeptical about the potential for some big Russia-Trump deal, which is that actually Russia exports a lot of commodities that the U.S. doesn't buy from Russia or want to buy from Russia. In some cases, mines and in oil and gas produces itself. And in gas in particular, the U.S. has gone, since the full-scale invasion, has become the world's largest natural gas exporter through liquefied natural gas. It's been a huge booming market, something Trump has demanded that Europe buy more and more of. And actually something he spoke about in his first administration when, remember, he was, opposed to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Now he acts like this is sort of some, moment where he stood up to the blob and everybody else. Almost all American foreign policy voices that focus on Russia thought Nord Stream was a terrible idea, but it was also a German one and a German decision. And Trump can't get the Europeans to just choose to restart the natural gas pipelines from Russia. And if all that Russian natural gas did flow again, or the 110 billion cubic meters of natural gas projects that Vladimir Putin wants to build, and nominally has being built, but which are currently constrained by sanctions on them, then that will crash the natural gas market that has done so well for the last 2 years, and be very negative for a lot of those U.S. Investors in those projects. Now, on sort of will companies be willing to go and, invest in Russia again in mass numbers? I think not, even if there is some kind of deal that fully tries to lift tons of sanctions. That's for two reasons. One, the Europeans will make their own decisions on sanctions policy and are far less likely to lift them, even if Hungary tries to throw up more blockades there. Europe has also worked through its own essential attempts at secondary sanctions legislation, so that's sanctions for violating sanctions, even if one doesn't directly use the European financial system, using an innovation that America has long used, and that was the same underlying threat that Trump was using to ensure European compliance with the economic ramifications of his withdrawal from the Iran deal. And then finally, Russia's a terrible place to do business right now, regardless of the sanctions, because Putin is promoting additional cronies to take things over. You've had a return to some of the lawlessness. You have a stagflationary economy. The people who would potentially make money are like commodities traders based in the Middle East and in Switzerland, not exactly the core of America First interests, who could get back and take up a lot of that activity that has been constrained, at least from their involvement, by the oil price cap, the sanctions on other commodities, as well, and the domination of China and taking over a lot of those export sources. Of course, also, Trump is looking to get oil prices lower while having the U.S. drill more at the same time, even if the U.S. has a higher cost of production. The OPEC Plus alliance is perhaps outside the scope of this conversation, but is essentially the tie-up between Saudi Arabia and Russia to try and protect their position and keep oil prices at a sustained level as outlooks for global oil demand continue to decline. And China's relatively weak growth essentially means there's a soft underbelly to the market at the time. And, for a long time, I've tried to make the point that between 2014 and 2022, the OPEC Plus alliance was actually Russia's greatest foreign policy success. Certainly, at the time, a lot of people spoke about Syria. I certainly don't claim any expertise in that or that I foresaw it going wrong, but I always saw the strategic importance of Russia's position in Syria, which has, of course, completely collapsed over the last few months as entirely overblown compared to this. And it's just remarkable to me that the Trump administration seems to have no policy on that whatsoever. The fact that he gets along with Mohammed bin Salman so well has helped drive Saudi Arabia to now say they finally will go ahead with some production increases from April this year, and that Russia has agreed to go along with that. But that was already on the cards, right? That was something that OPEC Plus agreed to previously, in which the Financial Times reported as early as last September was Saudi Arabia's plan, which is the dominant partner in that relationship. So, in terms of talking about Russia's overall international economic position and how the U.S. can change its approach to it, that is a huge area where the administration just doesn't seem to have a policy, and where I perhaps expected big changes compared to the Biden administration's policy, which was initially to take a stronger role against Saudi Arabia, but then rapidly reversed. Biden's initial promise to treat Mohammed bin Salman as a pariah then ended with, a year later, he was giving him daps on visits to the Middle East, in large part because of how important Saudi Arabia is to that market that was at the time also so disrupted by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
And on that note, Max, thank you for stopping by again. Learned a lot this episode. We'll be covering this issue and many more in episodes to come.
Thank you so much for having me.
We covered a lot of ground there. Thanks again to Maximilian for joining, and to you, listener, as well. What do you think about the prospects for peace, or at least a durable ceasefire in Ukraine? Let us know at the Twitter and/or X handle @BearMarketBrief. The Bear Market Brief is a project of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, that's FPRI, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. For more information on this initiative and on many others, visit fpri.org. We'll catch you next time.